Hi, Year 12s. This is Mrs. Sharon. I've made a very short video on fiscal policy and in the context of the budget balance and its effect on the economy. So, some of you chose to complete a question in your mock exam based on this, and it seemed like you needed a bit more help, which is what the purpose of this video is. So, we'll jump straight in. So, the syllabus dot points that the video touches on are on the screen now, so have a quick read. So we're going to start off from the very beginning. So there are two ways in which the budget balance changes. So first of all, we covered discretionary policy, and discretionary policy are policies which the government implements, which causes changes to government revenue and expenses. So these policies need to be changed explicitly by the government. It isn't automatic. Which is why automatic stabilizers are a separate concept, but they're discretionary in that there needs to be a change in how the policy, let's say, sets the tax rate or how much the government is spending on infrastructure. So those are the two examples I put down below. So first example is the revenue side, where a reduction in the tax rate would then result in lower tax revenue collected. On the expenses side, if the government decides to, let's say, build a new train station, then there would be an increase in infrastructure spending, so an increase in expenses. So discretionary policy is quite different to the automatic stabilizers, as automatic stabilizers fluctuate due to changes in the business cycle. So, for example, on the revenue side, if the government so if the economy enters into a contraction, so a reduction in economic activity occurs, income and business tax collected reduces. The reason for that is jobs are less available, unemployment increases, and less people pay income tax. On the business side, less goods and services are being sold, so then less tax is collected, and that means that less business tax ends up in the government's coffers because of that reduction in flows through from businesses and from workers. On the expenses side, when the economy is in a contraction, often welfare spending increases in order to support those who are out of a job, and that is an example of an automatic response by government expenditure in response to changes in the business cycle. So the key thing here is the government didn't have to do anything different for these changes to occur. Automatic stabilizers, as the name suggests, automatically stabilizes the economy. So with those two types of changes in mind, I wanted to describe how they impact the budget balance. The budget balance, as mentioned on the screen at the moment, is made up of two components. One is the structural balance and two is the cyclical balance. So discretionary policy, so remember changes in the tax rate or decisions to build infrastructure, fall under the structural balance component. Automatic stabilizers, however, only impact the cyclical balance because they respond to changes in the business cycle. If we add those two balances together, we end up with the overall budget balance. So if there is a change in the budget balance, both components, that is the structural and the cyclical balance, could change, or only one of them might have changed. So it really depends on the context in which you're discussing changes in the overall budget balance. The reason why we differentiate between structural and cyclical balances is that the stance of fiscal policy or the impact of fiscal policy is only determined by the structural balance and not by the overall budget balance. So if the structural balance is in a deficit, that would suggest that fiscal policy is expansionary. If, on the other hand, a structural surplus is in place, that would suggest that fiscal policy is contractionary. So you will realize that whether fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary does not relate to the cyclical balance at all. So it's not mentioned in the slide. The reason for that is, as the first dot point says, the stance of fiscal policy is only determined by the structural balance. So we'll go through this in a bit more detail using this question, which was the question you attempted, or some of you attempted. So we're focusing on A, and I'll read that out. In May 2018, the government planned for a budget deficit of $14.5 billion. The actual budget outcome was a deficit of just $4 billion. Explain the reasons for this difference and discuss whether this would have an expansionary or contractionary effect on the economy. So we're going to focus on the last section, which is about discussing whether the budget has an expansionary or a contractionary effect. But if we're looking at it at a very superficial point of view, we see that the estimated deficit is larger than the actual deficit. So rather than having a deficit of $14.5 billion, there was a deficit of $4 billion. So if we were to describe whether that impact was contractionary or expansionary, you would think perhaps that it has contractionary effects because the deficit is smaller than expected. But as we've covered already, the effect of fiscal policy depends on the structural balance and not the cyclical balance. So we need to determine what happened to the structural balance before we can consider the effect of fiscal policy. So on the left side of this slide, I've put a graph of the Australian government's structural budget balance, as well as the overall budget balance. So the structural balance is the black line, and the underlying or overall cash balance are the column bars, or the columns. So we can have a look at the 2018-19 year, so the year that is slightly to the right of the leftmost dashed line, and you can see that both the structural budget balance, which is the line, and the column, which is the overall balance, are both in deficits. So what are those figures exactly? So Australia's overall deficit was 0.2% of GDP, while the structural balance was a deficit of 1.9% of GDP. So straight away, we can tell that the federal budget in 2018-19 had an expansionary effect due to Australia's structural deficit of 1.9% of GDP. So what are some examples of discretionary policies that the government had implemented over that year? So first of all was a lowering of tax rates on small businesses. So we mentioned that that was an example of discretionary policy, and that was implemented, and that leads to an increase in investment. So always think about the effect of these discretionary policies, and then you can link it to the broader movements in macroeconomic indicators. So the second example I've included is an increase in transport infrastructure spending. So that would increase G because it's an expenditure from the government. The third example is an increase in spending on public hospitals and healthcare. That is another example of an increase in G. But we don't want to stop there because you want to think about the multiplier effect which flows through the economy as a result of an increase in I and in G. As investment increases and as government expenditure increases, the resultant increase in income will then lead to higher consumption as people are paid more. So small business owners might hire more workers due to that increase in I, and thus pay these workers a wage, and those workers would then end up consuming more. In the government sector, increased spending on public hospitals might result in more doctors being hired or more nurses being hired, and these doctors and nurses then spend money in the economy, which increases consumption. So always consider the multiplier effect when you're thinking about these sorts of questions. So in summary, these are your key takeaways from the video. Number one, the budget balance is made up of the structural and cyclical balance. Discretionary policy impacts the structural balance. Automatic stabilizers impact the cyclical balance. The stance of fiscal policy depends only on the structural balance. And there are two cases. First is a structural deficit, which has an expansionary effect. And the second is a structural surplus, which has a contractionary effect. So that's all I wanted to cover in the video today. If you have any questions, please send them through, and all the best with your study for Friday's exam.